We're back after a series of presentations, and I think that gave you overall perspective of how we potentially look at the successes of our programs, or what are the measurement tools which we are trying to use to do that. We have a list of questions which we got from Stacy and Lisa. I'm trying to find the right file here. 1 second. And okay. So I don't know if the audience can see that now.
We can see one of your folders.
Yeah, we see one of your folders.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's not very good. Hold on a second. Okay. How about now? Is that better?
Yes.
Those are your slides.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
If you can click on the discussion, there you
Yeah.
Yeah, there you
Okay.
go.
Well, I guess we all have challenges with video and sharing, so I apologize. So this is the list of questions, and I think that the audience had the opportunity to look at these questions as well. Let me maybe read quickly through that just to realign the conversation after our presentation. So I think the main thing really is, how do we view success, and what we can qualify as success of programs within NNI, and what maybe was not as successful as we would like. And also, what is important, there is a wide range of not only fields, but areas of programs which NNI is covering. And on one hand, of course, it's a success of fundamental science, but then also is success of moving this science to translational and commercial stage, developing infrastructure, education programs, and do we perform this development responsibly? And what are the indicators that the NNI framework is successfully supporting the community, and where this support is not as strong as we would like, and what needs to be aligned to make it better? And finally, what are the metrics to measure this success, and what are the approaches to collect the data supporting basically evaluation of success? And I think what is important, and that comes across in questions, which are already showing pretty well in the chat box, is that really there is number of matrices which can be used to measure the success. I think what we're used to mostly is looking at number of publications, their impact factor, number of companies, patents, and so forth. But in reality, there are people who are actually engaged, and that's their main job rather than the side job, to look at the evaluation of programs, and they develop number of different matrices. I had a book which for some reason doesn't show on my slides right now, which was written by Rand Corporation, which actually showed that they had 100 different matrices of how to look at the program. So I think what is important is to on one hand look at the success, but on the other hand to have also appropriate measures to measure them. So I don't know, after this brief introduction, do you have any additional comments? I'm talking to members of the panel, and if not, there is also a number of questions which we can start addressing.
Do you want us to basically address each one of these sequentially?
Well, so I think, let's maybe intertwine it. If you have some initial comments, that will be great. And I don't want to leave the audience out of the conversation. Maybe then we'll start looking at questions and we'll just intertwine between us and the audience.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think as we heard in a number of the talks and also in some of the comments from the audience, it's relatively straightforward to measure the big commercial impacts. And in your talk, in Chris's as examples, if something turns into a technology or a company, great. I think Chris did a good job also of saying, there are a lot of other threads that don't do that. And the question is how we follow those. It's very good. You got that up on the slide. Yeah, I went and looked at that, and it's just the kind of laundry list of kind of useless metrics that are really easy to gain until you get to the part of the easy to measure ones, right? And so if you look at those big applied impacts, great, but that isn't going to be what leads to new discoveries. And that's been a hallmark of the National Nanotechnology Initiative, and that's what's led to those new technologies. And so, what I think we need to figure out how to do is how to encourage those and how to reinforce their importance. And Professor Kurt Kolosinski, a speaker from earlier in the week, had some comments about how we might do that in terms of programs, including social scientists, communications, and we also heard about the education and training parts from Mike just a few moments ago that will help lead in that direction.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I think is important is that this was a comment that we had in the panel earlier when we got together before this session, is that nanotechnology is not the end point, at least not in the vast majority of cases. It is sort of a borrowing from the semiconductor industry, Intel inside, nanotechnology inside. And so the concept of nanotechnology intensive industries, which are not necessarily those that immediately come to mind when you think of nanotechnology. I think it's really important to think of those and also pay some attention to where that nanotechnology is coming from and where it is being capitalized on. Because I think in many cases, the answer is not necessarily the United States. And it might be good for humanity writ large. It might or might not be good for the United States and its citizens.
I'd like to also
go ahead, John.
Add some remarks if I could. And I'd like to call us back to the quadrennial review of the NNI, the 2020 report. It had a number of recommendations, and it included align the NNI to deliver nanotechnology solutions with the goals of the federal R&D priorities. And it pointed out this may change rapidly. And so a word that was used there, and we've heard through this workshop, is the need for agility, agile infrastructure, an agile trained workforce, agile capabilities. This report also talked about strengthening and expanding lab to market innovation ecosystems. And we heard about the need for effective connections between NNI stakeholders, industry, and academia. The fact is a network provides agility, and the better we can create that network, I think the stronger we'll be. And although I'm not doing justice to the recommendations, another example is strengthening and renewing the U.S. network of fabrication and characterization facilities in order to retain international leadership. 10 years ago, we were the clear leader in this space. I'd say other regions of the world are starting to head towards parity. And one thing that came up in the chat box is the idea of an inventory of current capabilities aligned with future needs, and a mechanism for replacement of aging tools to support acquisition of state-of-the-art infrastructure. And then finally, and we heard about this in the last presentation, we need to attract and train the best students in nanoscience and nanotechnology. And I would say we need to go beyond the REU programs. look at how do we create interdisciplinary research teams? How do we give students hands-on experience with nanotechnology, perhaps through companies and internships? And also mentioned, I think in a comment, was to provide an experience to veterans and bring them into the nanoscience workforce. So if we have any goals in terms of metrics and things, we should make sure the metrics actually tell us if we're achieving our goals. And so I'd like to put those out there as part of our discussion.
Oh, very good. Thank you, Chris. And I'm glad that you are starting to, refer our conversation to the questions. Yeah, there was one of the comments on the infrastructure and engaging NNI or NNCR in trying to coordinate information flow and understanding what are the parts of the infrastructure, whether these are user facilities or other facilities which are becoming outdated and potentially need to be replaced. Then, of course, the second question will be who will pay for it. But I think having a more comprehensive understanding of that across the country will be important. The other thing which came early on in the chat box was assessment of success or not of commercialization. On one hand, Paul, and I agree to a large extent with that, said that in some ways is more measurable than a lot of things like assessing the basic research. But the person who asked the question made a comment, and I think that's valid, that at the very beginning, 15 to 20 years ago, some of the projections, and I think that's not necessarily true with nanotechnology, but with any new technology, were very aggressive. And nanotechnology in general was viewed as something which will, create a lot of jobs in this country or worldwide. And I think some of that materialized, but maybe not to the extent to which these early projections promised. And question is, would we need to engage? Because in reality, NNI, most of the programs are funding academic work. And if commercial success or market success obviously is part of the success of the field overall, should the communication and discussion with industry folks should be broadened and looking at the on one hand commercial opportunities, on the other hand today's success in that space be measured more collectively.
May I make a comment?
Yeah, sure. And there is a question for you, John, as well, specifically about ISN. So that's a good transition.
Right. So I'd like some, I have some general comments, but actually to go to the question, I'll read it quickly. It says, how has ISN facilitated transition from basic research to use such that it is possible to track how the product is directly traced to the foundational research done? And I just wanted to mention, because I can only speak informatively about the ISN. And I gave some examples in my talk today of what we thought were important transitions. The key, I hope the message got across, is we were starting from basic research to development, to transition, to an industry, to a product that is sold. That was possible because of a very important aspect, and that is the key, I really believe, to whatever successes we've had at the ISN stem from the ISN's synergistic academia, industry, DoD, in our case, partnership. That's very close. We work very closely together at every step of the way. And I think that is really what helps take basic research, enable it to be transitioned, and this is basic research on nanotechnology that we're talking about, be transitioned to the Army, to other actually US military services and industrial companies. And one important aspect of having this 3-member team that I was focusing on is at MIT, it acts as an attractor. It attracts people who've never had, in our case, DoD funding, getting them interested in DoD types of problems. And that also, I think, is an important aspect of sort of building the community, the nanotechnology community, at least in our specific case. But I want to go back to some of the things that were mentioned earlier and echo really a few of these ideas. And in terms of view of success for NNI, there are various things that enter. But I think one important aspect in my mind is that really NNI continues to be a strong and influential voice and agent for nanotechnology as an important enabler of innovative technologies to solve the difficult problems in sort of the multiple areas of the U.S. national needs through the research, development, and commercialization. And for the importance of academic basic research in nanotechnology across multiple disciplines to stimulate innovation, but also assure a STEM-educated U.S. workforce. And also for basically sustaining infrastructure support to the NNI's established multidisciplinary R&D facilities and R&E centers that are devoted to nanoscience and technology. And finally, a very important thing that NNI does, I think, and should continue to do, is for timely periodic assessment of the U.S. nanotechnology program, so that one can connect to new and emerging national problems with viable nanotechnology-enabled solutions.
Thanks. So actually, that made me think about something else. So it's very good, as you said, and of course, as has been done every few years, that NNI is reviewed and I think pretty thoroughly every few years. There's not that many programs which cut across all government agencies. And in some ways, probably some other programs, which of course may not attract or may not use so much funds, may not be as thoroughly evaluated because simply in many cases their evaluation may fall on individual agency. So I think on one hand, we have possibly a harder job here to do because of that. On the other hand, of course, that's good for the field overall that such conversation takes place because it looks at a number of different facets, a number of different applications, rather than explicit one area of science. I just read a question here, which I think is relevant to what we are just talking about right now. And it's related to, in a way, partitioning the measurement of the success that the caller says the NNI R&D is so broad that it seems very difficult to try to assess impact on a global manner. Would case studies of specific technologies be a possible approach? And I think that's certainly true. I don't know if there are any comments from other panelists on that.
I agree.
Yeah. I think the anecdotal, right, the anecdotal parts do us a lot of good. And maybe coming back to what you and Chris and Julia had mentioned about, what it is we want for the future and how we're going to measure it, we can work upstream in both cases, right? If we want the very top students, then we should be inspiring kids to want to be nanoscientists. And it's incumbent upon us to do that. By the time someone's becoming a vet or, they're already an undergrad, in many cases, that's too late. We want to get to them when they're, really imagining their future. Likewise with the, replacing the decaying infrastructure, which was part of one of the chat messages as well. One of the things we need to be able to do is to develop the tools of the future that we'll use in our laboratories, that industry will use. And that's something that's been very difficult to do in the United States. It's hard to get sustained support for the, years or decades that it takes to do that. And so, the DOE labs have some, set aside for that, but they don't have necessarily the exposure that we do to the entire community or that we do at individual universities. There are places overseas that have sustained support, but again, they're much more siloed than what one might want to identify really a tool that would be revolutionary in terms of capabilities and the questions that we could ask with it. And so one way to think about the metrics is, what would you want to say about the NNI in the future? And then establish the metrics to push us in that direction.
Yeah.
If I could add something, I mentioned the idea of longitudinal studies, and I'll just tell you a little bit more about Pacific biosciences. The student, Steve Turner, was at Cornell, and I knew him as a student, and he had this interesting, in my mind, extremely blue sky project of using nanophotonics to measure DNA sequences eventually. I knew him in part because I watched his parakeets for a month. And what I didn't realize was that by watching his parakeets, he could go travel and learn more about the nature of the photonics and how to sequence DNA. And I didn't think that watching his parakeets might help me avoid a pandemic. But I guess my point in the story is it's very hard when you're right in the moment to know what will in future have impact. And in some ways, you can only do this retrospectively. You'll also guess by the name Pacific Biosciences, they're not in upstate New York anymore. And so all of these things need to be observed. And I think to Paul Weiss's comment, if we kind of know what we want to, what we want to be able to say about it, we don't want to write the report before we have the results. But at the same time, if we know what kind of information we want to collect and we do it over a period of time, I think we'll get a much better view than the typical snapshots we always take. So I think these snapshots don't show you trends the way they can, and we need to also factor in this more anecdotal approach.
I'd also, if I may make another comment related to nanotechnology that I think is often, at least not universally appreciated, that I think is a very strong selling point for nanotechnology. And that is, there's much more to nanotechnology than just making things small. The intrinsic properties of matter, their optical, electronic, mechanical, et cetera, actually become size dependent below a sort of critical length scale of a few hundred nanometers. And just sort of to give the audience, a scale, a human hair is about 90,000, basically, nanometers. And the fact that you have the size dependence that occurs when things are at this very small scale is very important, because this could lead to opportunities for new materials, phenomena, and properties that are unattainable in nature in their normal bulk form. And I think this is really a very important. I have, several examples of that. I don't want to go into it now because I don't want to take time from others in the panel. But that's, I think, a very important issue to keep in mind.
So, John, certainly so for a lot of, for people who are material scientists or physicists and are working in this space, that is most likely well known. But at the same time, as you say, when nanotechnology is finding more and more applications, on one hand, which are practical, on the other hand, which are not necessarily engineering centric, people who potentially can be interested in these applications may lose that fact, and they lose it. And in pharmaceuticals, they look at the nanoparticle as just the spherical thing to deliver the drug, but there is much more to it. And sometimes, within an NIH environment, I would hear comments, well, we already have one nanoparticle, so why do we need 5 more? Even they can have much more different properties. So yes, I think that, and that in a way ties to the whole educational aspect. And I think that, and Julia touched upon that in her presentation, and Mike as well. I think these are, and on one hand is to continue attracting students to STEM majors, which in this country probably occurs not as successfully as in some other countries, especially Asian countries. On the other hand, starting this educational effort and reaching out to the students at much earlier stage of education, so you can in some ways encourage them or at least present to them opportunities which they will have in college in that space. And I know that MIT, for example, had some of the programs for kids even from elementary school. I'm sure some other institutions do that too, but I think that needs to be ongoing process to convey to kids that career in science is not only for nerds, but it's also very cool. So I don't know if you I mean, most of you work in academia, so you probably have more thoughts and observations on that.
If I could just pitch in for a minute, I'm not from academia, but this business about workforce in general in STEM is huge. And the stagnation of math scores over the last decade, they have not budged in this country. And it's great that MIT does outreach that reaches a certain number of kids, maybe probably an impressive number of kids in the Boston area. There is a lot of this country that is nowhere near a research institution. And nanotechnology, I think, has an opportunity, not all that different from NASA and space, to really capture imaginations. And it doesn't have to be done completely in person. And so thinking about what kinds of online and virtual engagement and local museums and possibly modules for teaching and so forth and so on. Those are things that have the potential to capture kids as early as elementary school, and it should not be confined only to places where there are major research institutions. So that and your demographics aren't going to improve if you only go to the places that are easy.
Maybe I can things that Julia said. Number one, we should be recruiting the very top people from around the world to our graduate schools, to postdoctoral positions, to visits, and doing everything we can to keep them and integrate them into our academics, industry, and so forth. The other thing is, I'll just repeat, I think we haven't done a very good job of saying what the impact of nano has been, and that's come out in a couple of the comments, right? I think the public hasn't realized the nano delivery aspects of the COVID vaccines, right? Here's something that's staring every one of us in the face, waiting to see when we are able to get in the queue and schedule our shots. That ability to create the vaccines and to deliver them and to store them is all based on developments from our field. And there are a plethora of examples that we should be broadcasting out to the community so that, when kids are looking at fields and students or undergraduates, they're looking for opportunities to join the field and contribute, and then spread out into impact in other areas like, the cancer work that Peter organized at NIH, and the technologies for cell phones, computers, televisions, DNA sequencing that we've heard about throughout this week.
So this, just to pivot, and follow up on what Paul just said about the vaccines, and that also came through the comments in the chat. Obviously, both Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines are based on delivery of mRNA, which is only enabled by lipid nanoparticles. So that obviously will be probably the largest commercial success, because that potentially may mean production of 7 billion doses times 2 every year to vaccinate the whole world. What was interesting that as soon as there were some few reports on adverse effects of the vaccine, and of course they need to be looked upon very carefully, one of the science writers in Science wrote an article, do adverse effects come from nanoparticles which are required to deliver the vaccine? So obviously, first of all, I don't think there is an evidence of that so far, but instead of, it is often that we get a bad press.
A negative.
Unfortunately, but that's, I guess, that's what happens in journalism. So, and again, obviously, I don't know how many people read that article, but that I thought that COVID vaccine will be actually in great favor to nanotechnology or nanomedicine, and hopefully these adverse effects issues will sort themselves out. And in reality, number of them is very, very low. But anyway, so that I thought was interesting. Talking about commercialization, I see another question in the chat, or concern that even a lot of technology or new fundamental science is being developed in the U.S. Some of that knowledge is being commercialized abroad, and then of course that factors to the leadership of our country. I don't know if you have, if any of you have any thoughts on that or comments.
I'll weigh in briefly. From my small perch, looking at what goes on at our facility and other sites in NNCR, we do tend to focus on the successful startups that stay domestic. But we do get to see what a challenge it is to starting up a new technology. Many of them work for a few years and then they fold up, and so you can imagine that technology has the possibility then to go to other countries as perhaps the individuals find backing at another location, or perhaps someone picks up the patents and moves them. So maybe this is something else that can be looked at. I would like to believe it's a small fraction of what goes on, but it speaks to the difficulty overall of starting up a company in a new venture. I think, John, in your discussion about ISN, you have a lot of home runs. How do you amplify the chance of success?
I think that a very important aspect is the infrastructure at MIT that enables students, postdocs, et cetera, who are going to do a startup company to do it right from the beginning, to know what are the really key issues. And I just happen to have in front of me here the sort of a list of the MIT Entrepreneurship Ecosystem. And I'll just mention a large number of facilities that students have. There's the Technology Licensing Office that helps in doing the patents and encouraging students to do that. There's the Venture Mentoring Service. This is a service of people from a variety of expertise, lawyers, patent attorneys, people who've been in industry at high-level positions. It is a pro bono type of thing where they allow and give time to work with startup companies that have some connection to MIT, that at least one person is an MIT student or postdoc, et cetera, to help them along and guide them along the way. There's the Deshpande Center that helps in doing some funding, the Translational Fellow Program, what's called the Sandbox, to help small seed funding, the 100K entrepreneurship competition, and a variety of others, frankly. So that aspect of having an infrastructure at an institution which could really help the students and postdocs, the ones that really have no idea of what starting a company, how to really proceed and what the important issues are, has helped us tremendously.
I think I can address that as well and amplify what John said, because we even have a built-in control experiment here. So with a drug that got licensed, Xtandi at UCLA sold a royalty stream for several $100 million and invested that into that infrastructure for entrepreneurship. So when we have something that can be commercialized, we can get good patent attorneys, we can get consultants for regulation. We have a team that brings around potential CEOs. We get a couple $100,000 from each of several places that can move the technology forward towards commercialization. And it's really changed how things operate and put us on a much steeper gradient with the kind of advice and support that John was mentioning exists at MIT, which we looked at there, and Stanford, Columbia, and others, about what worked and what didn't in each place. And having those teams in place and in different areas, even for different parts of our own research group. We have 3 different teams of lawyers we work with according to what we want to patent. All that has really helped move things forward very dramatically and efficiently, and avoided the kind of missteps that I think kill off a lot of startups.
So that's how I think that's certainly true, and the universities on both coasts have developed pretty impressive capabilities to do that and make these seamless transitions that often graduate students who are involved in the development of the technology in academia then move with the technology to the startup. I think that that whole notion and infrastructure to do that is very uneven depending on which schools we are looking at. And the question is there any way to help and enable that at other institutions which may produce very good applied science, but then are not as well equipped to make the transition to the commercial space. So speaking of that, and there is one question from Tiffany Williams at NASA, which kind of touches upon that. She says that, one of the supporting tools to that kind of effort will be to allow graduate students to do internships, whether it's, for example, with the industry. At least in her opinion, students who are working in the lab on the graduate thesis may have hard time to get time off to do internships like that. And again, I wonder, since many of you, not all of you, are representing academia, is that your feeling, or would students be interested in internships like that? Would they, and if they are interested, would they be encouraged to do that?
At least at MIT, it's the summer program. We do try and get at least undergraduates connected in the summer to internship. It's much harder for graduate students, much harder. And I think that's a very good point. In our case, we lucked out, again, because of this 3-member team. We have industry scientists on site at MIT. When you have these collaborations going already, students, can get an idea of what's important for industry without necessarily spending,
time in the industry.
Not saying that's ideal, but at least it's something.
So at NIH, there's a program, training program called T32, and we had one center in California at UC San Diego, which actually promoted the training in conjunction with small companies, and that. So I think that that was feeding into that train of thought. I don't know exactly if that meant that students performed some of their thesis work in the company or not, but I think building these bridges obviously will continue to be helpful and useful, because again, depending on the university, some universities I think encourage students very highly to go to industry, and that's very true in engineering. But now when I deal more with biological sciences, I realize that a lot of biological training still paints a picture of only or most prominent career as an academic career, but in reality, there is one faculty opening for 7 postdocs in biology. So obviously, 6 people have to find a job somewhere else. And I don't know how much they are aware of the opportunities, whether industry or government or other places.
I think,
Some of our
John,
training grants require internships just like that, Peter, the NIH T32s and some of the others. It just depends on the particular program, but we take that to heart that it really helps to know how a company will operate quite differently than an academic laboratory. And, much like the veterans who come to our labs, the people who come back from those internships are often, very much more to the point and, thinking about their experiments in different ways.
Yeah, so follow on with that, there is a question related to SEMI and suggestion that maybe SEMI can be a great platform to build bridges between industry and academia to communicate the industry needs and industry opportunities in a clear way. Mike, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, certainly. So what I can say is in the design of the SemiWorks program, we actually really are considering this as more of a pilot that can be leveraged for all of the strategic industry sectors. And that's why initially we focused on, from a data perspective, in a population perspective, very broad-based, call it technician levels, right? Because those are similar skill sets and competencies that are required across most of the strategic industry sectors. It's the foundation. It doesn't mean that the system ultimately can't address more broadly, and above on higher tiers, but we focused on technician just because it has a broader appeal, a broader need, and a greater opportunity because of the numbers. Just to summarize there is what we're doing is almost look at the system focusing on the microelectronics industry initially as almost a pilot that can be expanded. So we're already looking at what it would take to expand that. And what that does is, and this is an NSF funded infrastructure development, what that does is it allows us ultimately to pull together that national talent pipeline, not only for the electronics industry, but across all the industry sectors. So for example, if someone really wants to work for a chip maker, how many jobs are there actually in chip makers, right? With chip makers. But that said, by the way, chip making, if you look at it, it's very cyclical, right? The business. But when talent moves from one sector to another, the system would allow them to align with other strategic industries, leverage their skill sets and move. So that's absolutely what the plan is longer term. And we're already working on that. The other thing, if I may, Piotr, is looking at, there's also the comments regarding starting to develop the talent pipeline earlier on in a way that really gets kids interested in STEM. And I mentioned in part of the SemiWorks program is one of the 3 pillars is programs. If you look at, for example, the Real Robotics program, realrobotics.org, that's focused on a program that is bolted into any school district, and we really would like to scale it across the entire country in 4th grades, especially those school districts that can't even afford to keep their shingles on the roof, right? And again, for diversity and inclusion as a core design principle, we have found, we've already piloted that program. We find that at 4th grade, it's the right, kids are not distracted yet with other things. The lights are fully on, and they are looking at the kids regardless of their socioeconomic background or whether little girls, little boys, all together. Guess what? It's just absolutely works. So that comment is absolutely on the mark, and I think that the NNI and the coordinating office is uniquely positioned and has already demonstrated the capability to reach across various silos, various academia, government, industry, to help to create awareness with programs like that and help to scale. Develop an NNI badge that promotes internships and figure out how to align our federal infrastructure to promote it, for example.
That's very good. So I think that comes again to what we mentioned earlier, and I'm sure that was brought up in last 2 days as well, that NNCR has an opportunity, or NNI in general, has an opportunity to communicate. There may be many opportunities in things which are being talked about today, but they are siloed or very local, and not enough universities or schools know about it. So I think NNI definitely can play a communicator role to share that information with as broad of an audience as possible.
Piotr, can I make a comment, just one last thing about the workforce training side? As an undergrad, I was a co-op student, and that was a wonderful experience, and I benefited a lot from that. But that was aimed largely at undergrads. At the graduate level, where I have research students who have done internships at company, the challenge is the misalignment of objectives. I think that if NNI could help, or SEMI could help align those objectives better between academics and people in the industry, that would be great. Just as an example of a misalignment, a student did an internship, and we had an agreement the work was going to be publishable. Mm-hmm. And then partway through, the company told me, your student made a wonderful discovery. She may not tell you anything about it, it's proprietary, and she may not use it in her thesis. And please don't hold that against her, let her graduate at the same point. So that was a misalignment, I would say, of objectives. One thing, though, I did spend time in industry, and it gave me a different perspective. And over the years, I've seen much less movement between industrial science to academia and vice versa. I'm wondering if NNI could facilitate a program where industrial scientists come and spend some time at universities and, in effect, help with the pipeline, teach people what is expected in industry, give them that kind of valuable practical experience at a university, and then help to facilitate this movement. Again, it's not anything I've seen discussed anywhere, but it could be something that NNI, in partnership with SEMI, could do something really nicely with.
Very good. So I think that the educational discussion brought more comments here, and Sam Brower from Nanotech Plus says that building educational programs for students at MIT is one thing, but in reality, we need to bring it to basically range of middle or high schools to really start this education earlier, and that's not always easy in some parts of the country. The second thing, which touches upon on communication, Dick Siegel from RPI says that there is actually some effort, I believe, at their school, and there is a website, molecularium.com. So again, I think we already see a value of 1 hour conversation like the one we have right now, that some things we may not have been aware are popping up. So thank you again for a number of people who are contributing to that discussion and carefully listening what we are talking about and commenting in such a wide range of comments. We have only 5 minutes left. I just want to, since I represent a funding agency, there was a question from Christy Haynes, which touches upon COVID from different perspectives. She asked, what do agencies do when it comes to productivity during COVID-19 shutdown or limited operations of the university labs? So just to give her, very quick answer. So at the beginning, and of course I only speak for NIH, at the beginning, we introduced flexibility in submission dates. So that was at the very beginning, only between March and I think June of 2020. But of course, everybody understands that, under these regulations, people cannot be as productive as before when it comes to producing new data. So that is reflected during the discussions on grant reviews and also when it comes to evaluating the progress report. So I don't think there is a formal policy on that. but I believe that everybody understands that these are difficult times. So since we have only, literally 3 minutes left right now, I don't know if there are any closing comments from my colleagues on the panel.
I'd like to say something, if I could, very briefly. The very rich comments about education in K-12 and so forth really point out the fact that this is truly a systems problem, and it's about domestic workforce and investing in the future of the workforce, all the way from the kids that are just starting school and before that, all the way up to graduate students. We're talking about building the domestic base as well as continuing to be able to attract and retain top talent. They need the tools to work with. They need the universities and the other institutions to be strong. And there needs to be a sustained commitment to all of that. And it's a multi-pillared edifice that is required to make it all work. So, that makes it a very challenging problem, but I think we have to bear in mind that it takes all of those things to be successful for the whole thing to stand.
And it's very likely that a lot of issues we talked about are related or well connected to the issues with education, which we are talking about, and attracting a high number of people, because ultimately then they go to the workforce, and how successful research or commercialization is dependent on that.
Maybe coming back to Julia's comment about the regional effect of having some of the top universities localized, we have new tools because of COVID, right? We have a way to reach a very large audience as schools have gone online. And so if we can figure out how to use that now and beyond, then we will be able to reach the young public that we would like to. We have a public lecture series that we put out on Fridays where we have over 300,000 people attend every week, right? We should be able to do the same thing and provide content for the K through 12 teachers and use the technologies that we've developed and used during this year.
Yeah, so that's certainly true, that number of tools which existed but became much more popular to use during last year. I hardly make any phone calls. I do Zooms now, and before we did telecom. So I think that these tools are invaluable when it comes to communicate with broader communities at essentially very low or no cost. So I think that definitely can become a pattern which will change and hopefully improve the communication on things which we're talking about here. So, well, I think, that will be, I don't know how often NNCR will organize meeting like that, but I think it will be very good for us to save and I'm sure Stacy is already doing this, to save the questions from the chat box and also put together the comments which we brought to the table and see if in 2 years or so, we'll have some positive answers to these comments and questions. So if there is anything else, any of you would like to add? If not, I would like to...
I'd just like to thank all the people who sent in questions. They were very thought-provoking, even if we didn't address them. I think they're great. I agree 100%. It's always challenging to engage the audience into the conversation, and it's especially challenging when we do it via Zoom. So credit to everybody who sent the questions and who also listened to us. I remember Stacy was saying that about 300 people were registered to that workshop. So that's certainly impressive attendance. So thank you to all of you in the audience. Thank you to Stacy and Lisa for putting together that workshop and video specialists who made sure that we were able to communicate, and of course all of my colleagues on the panel who spend a lot of time preparing these comments and participating in the discussion. So thank you again, and
Now we'll go into 30-minute break. Chad Merkin from Northwestern University will give a plenary closing talk at 1:35. And I hope that all people who are listening to us will be able to sign for that talk. So thank you again, stay safe, and remember that nanotechnology is fundamental to the vaccination which you will give in next maybe 1 month or maybe 6 months.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.